All right. So we're at 6:06. Would you guys like to get started? All right. So welcome to all of those who have taken your time on a beautiful Tuesday evening in the dark and in the rain to come to our community forum to talk about middle housing aspects. And so Steve Faust and Elizabeth Decker will give us a detailed presentation walking through all of this. And so we're going to take the approach. We're going to kind of go segment by segment. We're going to talk about duplexes and then offer an opportunity to do a Q&A. So the chat function is what we're asking for. So if you have questions, put them into the chat. So we'll work through duplexes and triplexes and then quads and cottage clusters and townhomes based upon the work that our consultants have done. And so 3J Consulting, Steve Faust is our prime consultant on this project. And Elizabeth Decker from Jet Planning, she's the sub-consultant. She's doing all the heavy lifting, right, Steve? And we'll be working on code language for all of this. I think just kind of a quick couple pieces to it is that the legislature adopted House Bill 2001 to address middle housing. The first piece that Newburgh has to comply with, because we are a community between 10,000 but less than 25,000, is the aspect of duplexes. And so we're working on everything at the same time, but that's the first piece of information that will have to go before the Planning Commission and the City Council as we move into the spring of 2021. The committee on this, we do have an ad hoc committee, and they've been meeting. They've had 3 meetings so far, an orientation. They have had 2 sessions to talk about middle housing components of that. And so this is our first opportunity to talk with the community about middle housing and what that may mean for Newburgh as we move forward and being more efficient with the land supply that we have. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Steve.
Thank you very much, Doug. And Elizabeth, if you wouldn't mind putting our presentation up on the screen. Welcome, everyone. As Doug said, we appreciate you participating this evening. And we're a little bit ahead on that slide. So we'll cruise back to the beginning. All right, here we go.
Technical error.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide, Elizabeth. So tonight, what we want to do is expand a little bit on what Doug was talking about and give you an idea of what this project is and what we're trying to accomplish. Then Elizabeth is going to provide some background on what is middle housing, what does that mean? What are the different types of middle housing? And then dive a little bit more into the details of zoning for middle housing in Newburgh. And we'll have some questions for you and be available to answer questions that you have. And then finally, we'll wrap up at the end of the meeting with our next steps and ways that you can stay engaged in the project. So in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, first, the build off of the findings from the city's housing needs analysis. I believe that was completed in 2019, and I will share some of those findings in just a few slides here. Second, and very important, we want to provide opportunities for middle housing options to address Newburgh's housing needs. And then finally, Doug mentioned House Bill 2001. That is something we need to do in terms of complying with the requirements of that House bill. Okay, in terms of our overall project, you can see that this project began in late August, and we are required to complete the project, or at least key portions of it, or the consultant portion of it, by the end of June. And so we've set our schedule up accordingly. The blue square that you see in December is where we are today. So you can see our advisory committee is still going to meet 3 more times throughout the course of the project, and we'll be coming back in the second half of February with draft code updates, a draft form, proposed code updates for the Newburgh community to review and comment on, and all of that before we move to Planning Commission and City Council in late March through the first half of June. In terms of project outcomes, I'm just going to repeat what Doug said. We need to have the duplex code provisions adopted by June 30th, 2021. And then for other middle housing provisions, by the end of June, we will hope to have everything in place for the city to then take the next steps towards adoption, separate from what we're contracted for right now with the state. Okay, so I mentioned the housing needs analysis, a little bit of background or some key findings that we want people to keep in mind as we start talking about middle housing. The first is that housing is expensive, not just in Newburgh, but in most places. 38% of Newburgh households are cost burdened, which means that the household housing costs are greater than 30% of the household's income. And of that 38% of Newburgh households, more than 50% are renters. 56% are renters. Secondly, households in Newburgh are smaller than they used to be. Of 57% of households, so again, a little more than half of households, are made up of 1 to 2 people. And so this tells us that future housing in Newburgh, on average, needs to be smaller and more diverse to accommodate those changing demographics. Okay, in terms of more diverse housing, these pie charts show what we mean. Currently, you see that in Newburgh, 71% of homes in Newburgh are single-family detached homes. 6% are single-family attached, and 23% are multifamily. And the housing needs analysis shows a forecast for the next 20 years to see a shift in those percentages, so that we're seeing an increase in single-family attached and multifamily residences. So aiming for a shift to 60% single-family detached, 8% single-family attached, and 32% multifamily. So when we take those percentages and apply them to the 20-year housing need in Newburgh, we see that overall, Newburgh has a forecasted housing need of 4,035 dwelling units or homes. When we break those down by those percentages we just showed on the last slide, that means 2,400 approximately single-family detached units, 320 single-family attached units, and almost 1,300 multifamily units to reach that total of 4,035. So just some background and contextual information for you to keep in your minds while we move into a discussion of middle housing.
Great, thank you, Steve. So now that you're all housing experts, we want to talk a little about middle housing specifically, which is where this project will focus on making some improvements to get us towards those pie charts and towards those a slice of those 4,000 housing units that Newburgh is going to need in the next 20 years. So as we've been talking about this, or talking around, right, this project is really focusing in on middle housing, also sometimes called missing middle housing. And so as this diagram shows, it's a term coined by Dan Parolick of Opticos Development down in the Bay Area. And he really used this term to describe this whole rich variety of housing types that are somewhere in the middle between the traditional detached single family homes and the larger multifamily apartment buildings. And these have been traditional parts of many communities, dating back for the last 100 years. But they've been missing for the last 75 years, in part because of zoning code regulations and land use planning that's really sought to, define specific types of housing and keep it separate and tightly regulated. But missing middle housing, things like duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters and townhouses, even, here they show some small apartment buildings, which is outside the scope of our work, but, traditionally could be seen in this middle. These units can be smaller in scale, and because of that, there's less costs associated with construction and land prices. So it can really help fill a missing gap in our housing markets, both in Newburgh and across the state. So if we take this old idea and think about how it could meet our new housing need, as Steve said, we're looking in Newburgh to shift the housing mix to an increasing percentage of single family attached, which are townhouses, and multifamily. And so when you look at this 32% multifamily, within that includes everything from a 100 unit apartment project potentially, but it's anything that's 3 units or above. So many of these middle housing types like triplexes or quadplexes could help meet that slice of the pie and could very well be better suited to Newburgh's neighborhoods and Newburgh residents' needs. So again, it's about providing greater variety about how we meet that need moving forward that was identified in the housing needs analysis. And one of the first steps that needs to be taken is to look at the zoning code, the low density residential zoning districts in particular, that are, in large part to help explain why we haven't seen middle housing development for the last 70 odd years. And as we've talked about a couple times tonight, the Oregon legislature saw this problem across the state. It is not an Oregon problem. It is not a Newburgh problem. It's really a national problem. But Oregon took action at the state level with HB 2001 in 2019 and said that, to ensure that there's greater variety of housing choices available, the first step is for all cities over 10,000 people, which includes Newburgh, to allow duplexes on all lots where single family detached dwellings are permitted currently. Because we're planners, we had to introduce a new acronym here, and just to save some space, SFDD is for single family detached dwellings, or what we might think of as traditional homes, but we use that throughout here just to save a little space. So that's the first step, the duplex piece. And as Doug said, that's going to be our first priority, and we'll be working on that to get it adopted in Newburgh before June of this year. And then the second piece is for larger cities, over 25,000 people, an additional range of middle housing types to include triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters must also be permitted in those same areas. Not necessarily all lots, depending on lot size and some other factors, but generally speaking, in all the same areas where single family detached dwellings are permitted. And since Newburgh's population is getting quite close to that number, and because the housing needs analysis has identified the need for this greater variety of housing, the city has prioritized regulations to permit these housing types, and we'll be working on drafting that language as part of this project as well. Which brings us to, the full scope of this project. You'll hear it again tonight, but just to repeat, the full suite of housing types is duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters. And we're looking at ways to permit them in the zoning code wherever single family detached dwellings are permitted. And when we're working on that, we'll be thinking about how these regulations can apply to both new construction. So, you have a vacant lot and you want to build a quadplex, or thinking about additions and conversions of existing buildings. So that could mean adding on additional units or internally dividing an existing single family home to create that quadplex. Or perhaps you have one home on a larger lot and you add some additional smaller cottages to create a cottage cluster. And, since we're thinking about some potential conversions, that means we're looking at both existing neighborhoods. So what could be more infill opportunities where there is more of a neighborhood fabric where the new development will be fitting into, as well as new neighborhoods. Newburgh has significant areas planned for new growth to meet those 4,000 plus housing units needed for the next 20 years. And so making some opportunities to allow for these housing types to be built from the beginning is also part of this work. There are, of course, some exceptions of, areas where adding middle housing would be in conflict with other land use planning practices. So things like historic districts, stream corridors, floodplains, the Willamette Valley Greenway, those kind of resource areas. There are some additional standards that we can apply to balance the need for middle housing with the need for minimizing impacts to those resource areas. And also the legislation is really focused on residential zoning districts. And so we don't need to look at expanding these middle housing types into mixed use or high density residential areas. And when we translate that to the map and think about what that means for Newburgh, we're looking at primarily the residential areas, which are shown in a variety of yellow tones, shown on this legend. So all the way from the low density residential through the medium density residential and various permutations of those, depending on some special planning areas. But we'll be looking at the full scope of residential areas and thinking about how we incorporate middle housing. So you can see it's pretty well spread across the city. So lots of opportunities to think about how it works. And when you think about, that broad scale, I think there's a lot of questions about, but what does that mean in terms of the overall impact to the city and what the city of Newburgh might see as a result of this legislation. So, I wish in some ways that zoning code were so powerful, right? That with a mere stroke of a pen, we could create middle housing anywhere we wanted it. Or direct it where we wanted it to go or not go. But what we are more likely to see is that zoning code is really the first step along this path. And so we'll probably see more incremental growth of these middle housing types. It's been, decades since they've been permitted. And so it's going to be a slow process to get them going again, both in Newburgh and across the state. So, when we try to think about what this process might look like in the first couple of years, and what the impacts of these zoning code regulations are, I think it's important to keep in mind the initial scale is going to be relatively limited. So just that, the impacts might be more modest. When we think about some potential models, Newburgh has had some experience already, beginning with accessory dwelling unit regulations. And so the city has really streamlined those regulations and made it easier than ever to build an accessory dwelling unit like you see in this picture. And development, interest in those has still been modest. There's been about 10 to 12 units permitted over the last couple of years. So, some interest, but starting slow. We also seen, Minneapolis made headlines for permitting triplexes on every lot. But has seen pretty limited permits in the first year or so of their implementation. And statewide, Oregon had to develop, some overall projections about what they might see, what communities might see for middle housing, in part to, for a more technical exercise to inform housing needs analyses. But point being, the best projection they came up with was, looking at about 3% of total housing stock coming from missing middle infill housing. And so, just to keep in mind, this is going to be part of, hopefully Newburgh's housing solutions, but it's going to be fairly incremental and relatively modest, especially to start off. And as I mentioned, zoning code is certainly an important step in terms of permitting these missing middle housing types, but it's part of a much larger team of factors that influence development feasibility. So zoning code, I like to say, is less like Superman and much more like your favorite member of the X-Men, as you see here. So the other, supporting members of the X-Men squad are going to be the building codes, system development charges or impact fees, requirements for public improvements like roads and water line extensions, developers' access to financing, consumer preferences, if people are interested in the, living in a quadplex rather than a single family detached home, and finding available land that can be developed this way. So there's a lot of factors that need to come together to support these missing middle housing types. And where we are as a community and with this project is really taking one of the first and exciting steps in making sure that these are permitted in the zoning code to open the door to all the future development and future changes that'll be needed to support that and make it right for Newburgh. So since we're really at the beginning of the process, zoning code is, the zoning code updates are really the first step along the way. And so we also need to think in terms of our larger community planning priorities, in terms of how should these regulations be written to address various needs across the community. So we've certainly, we've heard through a series of stakeholder interviews and our initial meetings with the advisory committees, as well as our review of the zoning code and the city's vision and comprehensive plan, that there's a variety of priorities all the way from, first of all, just having this greater variety of housing types, creating opportunity to increase the total number of housing units that are needed. Often, you can't talk about zoning without hearing that it needs to be more flexible, making regulations more flexible, creating opportunities for more for less expensive housing, making sure that there are opportunities within that for both home ownership as well as for rentals, and as well as thinking about compatibility within existing neighborhoods, including potential impacts of parking from some of these middle housing types. So some of these, we can address multiple priorities through through some regulations, but there are some trade-offs that are going to need to be made. And so getting the overall community priorities and thinking about that balance is going to be really important as we are developing these regulations. All right, so we want to take a breath here. We've been talking a lot at you, and just check if we've got any questions or comments about middle housing so far, what the concepts are and how they might, what the requirements mean for Newburgh. And if you have any initial thoughts on those priorities for implementation before we get into, we are going to talk through, as Doug mentioned, the specifics of duplexes and the various other types. But we'd love to get your initial thoughts.
And just a reminder that you can use the chat function to submit your comments and questions. We'll pause here for just a moment to see if we have any.
And not to interrupt your typing, but also to say, in addition to the discussion tonight, we will have an online survey that's going live that will closely follow the structure of this presentation and give you another opportunity to weigh in on this. So have a couple different ways for you to engage in the process.
And that survey will be posted on the project website along with a recording of this meeting and a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. Elizabeth, I'm not seeing any questions or comments right now, so let's go ahead and move to the next portion of the presentation.
Okay, great. Sometimes it's helpful to make it a little bit more concrete, right? So what we want to do now is to take you on a bit of a tour of some housing development types and thinking about what these new middle housing types might look like, and that might sort of spur our thinking more about the priorities for implementation and how to design the best zoning regulations for Newburgh. So when we're thinking about our priorities and shaping these and responding to some of these images, there's, at a minimum, at least two prior sort of perspectives that we're evaluating these housing types and these regulations from. So the first is sort of, if you will, imagine that you're the owner of the property and you're thinking about, what am I able to do on this lot? What's feasible to develop? And are these regulations creating opportunities or barriers? That's the first step of thinking, like, can we actually get these middle housing types developed? Is it feasible under the regulations? And what would it take to make the regulations more flexible and more feasible? And then the secondary perspective, or an additional perspective, not secondary in terms of less important, just additional, is then if we sort of rotate out and think, if we're a neighbor walking down the street or we're a member of the community, what are the priorities in terms of regulation for making sure that whatever gets developed on that site is able to be integrated with the surrounding neighborhood and makes sense in that context, whether it's an infill site or whether it's a new development, a whole new neighborhood. So we've got at least those two perspectives that we'll be evaluating these projects and regulations. So as we start with our duplexes, duplexes in some way are the easiest of these types, and sort of the least flexible, I would say. The HB 2001 is very direct in saying that the goal here is to make sure that every duplex is regulated the same as a single family detached dwelling. And so wherever you can do a single family detached home, wherever it's a permitted use, you should also be allowed to do a duplex on the same size lot. So the same minimum lot sizes would apply, the same maximum lot coverage applies, the same dimensional standards like setbacks and height, any design standards that apply would also apply, equally to single family detached dwellings and duplexes. And then the other clear direction that's in the state requirements that we need to implement in Newburgh is the parking standards. And so the city can set minimum numbers of off-street parking spaces that can be required. That doesn't say, many developers choose to build more than the minimums, depending on where a property is located and the market and eventual consumer that they're aiming at. But the city minimums for duplexes cannot exceed 1 parking space per unit, or a total of 2 spaces per duplex. So they can go lower than that. There can be some additional flexibility built into it, and we'll talk about that. But that's really the upper ceiling that we're looking at. So when we start thinking about what these duplexes look like, again, it's been at least 75 years since many of these housing types have been built, at least in large numbers. So we're going to see some big differences between older style duplexes and newer style duplexes. Not just architectural design, but some of the massing and scale concepts as well. So we'll be looking at, there could be corner duplexes coming in. Those can be really great in terms of taking advantage of the 2 lot frontages. Also looking at how duplexes can be arranged as side-to-side units rather than stacked one on top of the other. So some different opportunities here. Another theme to keep in mind as we look through these is how the parking garages and driveways are organized. So here you see side-by-side garages, but they've separated the driveway. And here you see more of a shared driveway approach, but otherwise a pretty similar massing concept for this side-by-side duplex. Another attached duplex, you can see here the interplay between how far the garages project versus the front doors and what impacts that could have on the streetscape and people coming by. Another duplex example in this one, they were able to move the parking to be accessed from the rear, and obviously that has some implications for how the facade works. Another option we'll be talking about is whether to permit detached duplexes. And so here's one example of what that might look like. It's really just 2 smaller detached dwellings on a single lot, rather than having the 2 units attached. And then when you start thinking about, as we say, this could also be in new neighborhoods. And so if you have multiple duplexes being built on a single block, how that might affect the neighborhood character and the overall impact compared to having a single one as more of an infill project. So as we think about duplexes, I'm happy to go back to any of the individual building and any of the individual pictures if that helps the discussion. But we wanted to give you a chance to hear your questions, comments, ideas, concerns about duplexes specifically and how they could work in Newburgh.
We'll give it just a minute here, Elizabeth. We don't have any submitted just as of yet.
I wish I had some fun duplex facts to share with you all. I'll have to work on my material.
Duplex trivia?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not seeing any questions about duplexes. We can always revisit duplexes if people have questions later on, inspired by the conversation about other middle housing types.
Great. Okay. So let's up the intensity, shall we? And move from duplexes into triplexes and quadplexes, where you've got 3 or 4 units on the lot. And so, as we mentioned, the duplexes are the first part where we're going to allow them on every lot. And then triplexes and quadplexes and the remaining housing types that we'll talk about tonight. There's a little bit more flexibility here in terms of allowing them in all the residential zones, but with a few additional nuances, shall we say. So depending on the lot sizes in the zones, we're generally looking at the same minimum lot sizes for triplexes and quadplexes as for single family detached dwellings, and similar dimensional standards. So the smallest possible lot for a triplex would be 5,000 square feet, and the smallest possible lot size for a quadplex would be 7,000 square feet, or larger if the lot sizes in the zone are larger than that. There are some opportunities for triplexes and quadplexes to apply some clear and objective design standards that have to get at the appearance and sort of the function of the building. And clear and objective is a really important concept in Oregon land use, and essentially just means that there's only one way to interpret the rules. It's either a yes, you pass, or no, you don't, as opposed to more discretionary language like must be compatible with the neighborhood or use similar features and design approaches. That's just a little too difficult to interpret, and in some cases has been abused by cities as a way to deny housing that is otherwise needed in an area. But the state has really outlined some very clear and objective standards that we can use for triplexes and quadplexes if it's of interest locally. And then likewise, a theme that you're going to see repeated is the minimum parking requirements for triplexes and quadplexes are also set at a maximum of 1 space per unit. So that could be up to 3 or 4 spaces required off street, or less, and or with some flexibility depending on what's right for the community. So when we start thinking about what these might look like, again, here's an example of a corner lot that got developed with a triplex. Corner lots seem to be pretty good for these middle housing types. If anyone wanted to speculate on land, corner lots, it's the way to go. So here's a 3-unit project. You can see this project opted to use on-street parking rather than that allowed more housing units to fit onto the site and brought the units up closer to the sidewalk rather than having this frontage dominated by garages and driveways. Here's another view of that same project. You can just see how it's, or you can just kind of peek around the corner and see it's, similar scale in terms of height, 2 stories as some of the existing residential development in that area. Another take on a triplex, this one was able to also keep the frontages and the entrances on the front, and then bring all the parking around to the rear, fed by an alley or a shared driveway. If we start thinking about quadplexes, here's an approach where it's 4 side-by-side units rather than stacked. And, it's not one on top of the other. They're all next to each other in a line. And this one also, they got all the parking off of the front facade. So it's either served by rear parking or it's all on-street parking. Another quadplex, this one's an infill, also a corner lot. So you can see they also made the choice here to use on-street parking because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to fit these 4 units onto this site. And we're also seeing new quadplexes, new designs coming from some of the major builders. This is one in South Hillsborough that's proposed, and I think midway through the permitting process. So, it's a different architectural approach, but another way to get 4 units in a configuration that could be permitted. So when we start thinking about triplexes, there's certainly different massing and scale questions. And then there's these aspects about potential driveway configurations and parking. And so are there questions, comments, ideas on any of those aspects or other features about triplexes or quadplexes that you'd like to discuss?
We have one question here, Elizabeth. Most households own 2 vehicles. Do you see parking being a potential issue for triplexes and quadplexes?
Great question, and could definitely be about triplexes and quadplexes or any of these housing types. So what's interesting is that actually the numbers show that it's a little different, it varies a little bit community to community, but the census data show that nearly half of all households in Oregon have 0 to 1 vehicles. And so there certainly are a large number of households that have 2 or more vehicles, but there's a significant, nearly half of the population households that have, 0 to 1. So given that we have a whole range of housing types, I think the question becomes, what's the city's role in setting a minimum? And does it make sense for the city to set a minimum parking, or where should the city's minimum be set in relationship to those household car ownership patterns? And, in some ways, the state has sort of preempted this by saying you can only require 1. That they've taken that statewide data and said, look, half of the state has 0 to 1 vehicles available. So as a minimum, cities should only set 1 or fewer. So in terms of what does that mean for households that have 2 cars available, but there may only be a regulatory minimum of 1, I think that there's definitely some questions about how that could work in an individual triplex or quadplex. I think that, I would imagine that there's some individual preferences that come into play. If I'm a builder, for example, and I'm trying to go after a certain subset of the market, and I anticipate, that I have more detailed data about their car ownership patterns and wants, perhaps it's worth it to me to build additional parking above the city requirements, because I know that that's going to help my unit sell better. Or, on the flip side, if the plexes get built with only that 1 parking space per unit, and I'm a household that has 2 vehicles, maybe that isn't the right unit for me. Again, this middle housing is only part of the future housing needs for Newburgh. So I think there's gonna, need to be some sorting among households and about what housing is right for them.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Next question. Many infill projects have an angular or boxy look and tend to have walls with few to no windows. This doesn't fit well with the traditional look of Newburgh. So, what can be done in terms of giving flexibility on different requirements, setbacks, and maximum heights to allow more flexibility to developers? How can we, what are the options that the city can pursue to encourage housing that's more compatible with Newburgh's older neighborhoods?
Sure. So I think part of the secret is really drilling down into what are those features of existing neighborhoods that are, of interest to preserve or to replicate. And I think maybe if we talk about overall mass, or if we talk about roof angles, those are very clear and objective standards, right? You can set standards about maximum or minimum roof slope. You can set bulk standards in terms of either, maximum building sizes, or, by calculating the building envelope with height and setbacks. So those are all things that we can get at through zoning regulations. But as far as HB 2001 and introducing these middle housing types, the approach that we have to take at the community level is any regulation that you want to apply to middle housing types, more or less, also needs to apply to single family dwelling types. And so in Newburgh, there has not been a lot of design standards, such as roof angle or materials or architectural design details that have applied to single family homes. And so if we don't regulate single family homes that way, we can't really regulate middle housing that way, broad picture. So I think that, we'd love to hear through this process and in your comments about, are there particular features that you think are worth regulating for all housing types going forward? And I did want to pick up on the windows question. So there is one of the clear and objective standards that was developed at the state level to directly address that question for triplexes and quadplexes and townhouses too, I believe, is we can have a minimum percentage of window glazing for those housing types. And so that number is set at 15%. And I think that, you know, I can easily share some diagrams from the state that shows what that might look like. I think it has a little bit more impact than you might think. Just hearing 15%, it really adds a good number of windows. And when you think about the overall balance of facade and the different elements. So that is one specific tool that we have. And if that is of interest, we can implement it with our Plex regulations in Newburgh.
Thanks. I think this is a question for Doug. Any idea as to how many building permits were issued in the last 4 years for duplexes?
0. But we are working, we have a development that did a subdivision, and they're going to be on 3 lots. They're going to be doing duplexes. And we've talked with a developer who was looking to do 6 or 7 duplex units in another development prototype. But actually, Robert, you know, has something happened in the last 4 years? No.
Great. Thank you, Doug. All right, Elizabeth, I think we're ready to move on.
Okay, great. And you all will see that there are recurring themes in these. So if there's anything you missed, you'll have another chance. So our next missing middle housing type to feature is townhouses. And that's, you know, we also seen in that single family attached category, sometimes how it's defined. So Newburgh has some history and some built examples of townhouses, and we're just looking to expand those options. In part by allowing them in all the residential zones, so allowing them more broadly than currently, and then scaling the minimum lot sizes and dimensions to better fit attached units. And so, the state has, through the detailed implementation requirements for HB 2001, they've spelled out that the minimum lot sizes for townhouses should be no greater than 1,500 square feet in all zones. And similar to the triplexes and quadplexes, and for example, the window coverage standard we were just discussing, there is a menu of clear and objective design standards that can be applied to these townhouses. For townhouses, they also address a lot of issues about driveway approaches and relative size of the garage and driveway widths relative to the width of the house and the lot. So a lot of questions about the arrangement of parking. But the parking standard itself is similar to all the other housing types where the city can require up to 1 parking space per unit. So we gathered a number of examples. A lot of these are from either from Newburgh or from sort of the southern metro area, so places like Wilsonville and Tualatin and Tigard. Not exactly, so just sort of a mix of more recent development that we've seen. So 2-unit townhouse, of course, townhouses are all going to be side by side. They're not going to be stacked. They're each going to have their own individual individual entrances, and usually at least 2 stories. Oftentimes 3 in order to fit in this tuck under parking on the first floor. But getting that balance right between the driveway, the garage, the rest of the house, and the front door, I think is one of the central design challenges for townhouses. So you can see that there's different ways that this gets expressed. It can wind up looking somewhat similar, and it can have but then there's also some opportunities to use some different massing techniques. Here's, for example, or I was going to say, use some different architectural techniques. You have slight variations in paint colors and shingles here. But, we were talking about roof angles earlier. So, here's an example where they use similar roof angles across the building to more architecturally unite the project. Here's an opportunity to free up some of that facade by moving the parking off of the front facade so that the individual entrances can be a little bit more prominent, have a little bit more room for landscaping or yards. Here's a 4-unit example, again, has the parking in back, and this one also, this one has parking in back and really frees up sort of a more, yeah, just a home forward facade, shall we say, instead of a garage forward facade. We were talking about roof lines. Sometimes you get a different approach, and under, the Newburgh Code, I don't think that there's anything that addresses roof angles. And so, here's a different way that townhouses might get expressed. This is also 4 units. You've got 2 pairs of driveways, and then the front doors, kind of get a little bit lost almost there. Another way to get 4 units, I understand that 4 units is a real sweet spot for lending because you can still get a residential mortgage rather than a commercial loan if you're the builder. So oftentimes we'll see a lot of 2 to 4 unit projects rather than 5 or more. But here, this approach, if you count the front doors, it is actually 4, but took on, some alternate massing so that some of the units are larger than the others. So when we start to think about townhouses, you might think about some examples that are already built or some future examples based on those pictures, and curious to hear your questions, comments, ideas about how we go about refining the townhouse regulations in Newburgh.
All right. We don't have any at the moment, but we'll pause here and see if we get some. Elizabeth, we've heard in other communities questions about the relationship, to revisit the parking issue, the relationship between parking, and then we know that some of the reason that the state is pursuing these middle housing types is to try to diversify housing options and provide options that are less costly. What do you think about what can you say about the relationship between parking spaces and housing costs?
I love that it's what can I say, not what do I think, because we could be here all night with my opinions. I think that there is generally more parking can increase the cost of housing units. And so at a time when we really don't, as a state, we are in a statewide housing emergency and we're looking for greater variety of housing, that one tool to provide more housing units at more different price points is to decrease the regulatory parking requirements, which still means that many of these housing types can have, 1, 2, or more parking spaces. I think townhouses is certainly somewhere that we're likely to see, at least 1 or 2, often 2 spaces going forward, just because that's sort of the market segment that a lot of these townhouses are aimed at.
I'm not seeing any additional questions, so let's move on to cottage clusters.
Okay, so this is probably the newest and most experimental of the options, but cottage clusters are an idea of taking multiple smaller detached buildings, detached homes, and clustering them together around a shared open space, a common courtyard, a garden, or could be some paved space, more like a plaza, and that there are these a greater number of smaller units, and so therefore they can still fit within the residential fabric of a traditional neighborhood zone. So similar to the other types, we're looking at allowing these in all the residential zones. These we're going to look at siting on lots that are 7,000 square feet or larger. And on those size lots, allowing 4 or more of these smaller scale units. And we'll talk about those could be anywhere from 900 all the way up to 1,800 square feet. But, a lot of communities are looking at a max, around say 1,200 to 1,400, somewhere in the middle of that range. And similar to, and they're going to be 1 to 2 stories. And similar to all the other housing types, we're looking at 1 parking space per unit. And there's some flexibility here in our cottage clusters if we think about if we want to, traditionally parking spaces are also clustered, right? The parking is clustered on one portion of the lot and sort of a surface or a shared garage. And then the cottages are clustered in another part of the lot. But there's also been some other cottage examples where the parking has become more integrated with the individual cottages, which could be a little more functional for the actual residents. but maybe doesn't look quite so cutesy, shall we say, in terms of the picturesque cottage cluster. So some trade-offs that we'll get into. But in terms of to introduce the actual cottages, they have many of the same features as a single family detached house, just on a smaller scale. Cottages, sometimes we talk about tiny homes. Cottages are not really in the realm of tiny homes. Tiny homes are often can be as small as 100 or 200 square feet. And some of these cottages we're looking at here are closer to like 1,000, 1,200 square feet. So they're definitely still homes. They can have multiple bathrooms, multiple bedrooms, but still relatively small, one, sometimes 2 stories. And then the central organizing principle, right, is clustering them around a shared space. In this case, fairly traditional layout here from a project in Florence. It's got a central lawn and garden. These are all 2 to 3 bedroom units. Oh, I see one bedroom, so take that back. But the cottages are all clustered around that central space. And then here you can see a more clustered parking layout that gets the parking away from the dwellings. So it increases the interconnectivity between the dwellings and the relationship to open space. But you can also see that some developers are finding opportunities to do some modifications to this layout. So looking at ways that parking can be brought a little bit more conveniently, a little closer to the dwelling units themselves. So in this case, the site plan loops the parking through the site. And most of these units, still have access to open space. Some, there's this sort of main cluster here in the center that's all around. It's a little bit more traditional, but even these units on the periphery all have access to open space, and are clustered together. But we would need to look at some additional flexibility in terms of the orientation requirements and the parking arrangements if we wanted to add the flexibility to do this kind of a layout. Here's another sort of alternative layout for cottages where every cottage is served directly by an alley, so that they can have an alley loaded garage and have garage parking as opposed to that's more of a surface parking lot. But you still get the housing oriented towards these common tracts of green space. Their front doors are opening onto the green space, and it's just the garages that are on the alleys. So there are definitely some different configurations, and depending on which ones are of interest for cottages, we can look at different ways to write the regulations and where to add flexibility. So when you start thinking about these cottage clusters, curious to get your questions, comments about the possibility for introducing cottage clusters in Newburgh.
All right, we have a few questions and comments. The first is a comment. This is an exciting concept. It could provide reasonably priced housing and is very much in keeping with the traditional feel of Newburgh. There are several older cottage clusters nearby downtown. So good that there's a track record in Newburgh. And then a question, are the cottage cluster homes intended to be sold or rented or both?
Great question. So first, I just want to address sort of I'm not a housing economist, but thinking about like how affordable are, like what's the price point of these cottages? I think that one misconception can often be that because these are smaller, they should if they're half the size of a regular home, they should be half the price. And the thing about cottages is they still have all the most expensive parts of the homes. So the kitchens, the bathrooms, as I understand from builders, that's really what adds the costs. It's not the empty 4th bedroom that you're adding. So cottages can be a lower priced option, but they're definitely not, depending certainly on some of these regulations and how much open space and what the parking looks like. They're not necessarily the lowest cost option, but hopefully we can provide some flexibility so that they can fall somewhere along the cost spectrum and provide some different options. But as far as the question about ownership, the short answer is both. The initial draft of these, the way that these regulations have come out through HB 2001, the main focus is on allowing the cottages to be built on a single undivided lot. And so in that case, it's more likely that they would be rentals or possibly turned into a condo and sold off as individual condo units. There are some broader regulatory problems with the condo legislation that makes it less likely for developers to be interested in that, as I understand. So under the current standard, we're more likely to see a rental product, possibly some condos that could be owned. And then I think that the next question, as we, once we get these initial regulations in place, is moving forward with how do we create a fee simple subdivision option to create individual cottage lots that could be sold and could create homeownership. So I think that's a phase 2 of cottages.
Elizabeth, I apologize if you covered this earlier, but I know we've had questions before about, you spoke to the option for detached duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes, and how do those detached plexes differ from a cottage cluster?
Great question. And so the two main differences are just the number of units, right? So a detached duplex, like that picture we saw, or if someone chose to build a detached triplex with 3 individual units on a lot, it's just they would have fewer units. Cottages are, in order to have a cluster, you have to have 4 or more units. And then the other main difference is the orientation requirements. And that the it's not just cottages, it's the cottage cluster housing type. And so getting them in a cluster so that a certain percentage of them are facing onto that shared open space is the other key distinction. There's no requirement for shared open space or sort of that, central organizing principle if you have a detached duplex or triplex or quadplex.
Thank you. We'll pause just a minute to see if there's any more questions or comments about any of the topics that Elizabeth presented this evening.
Steve, I'll just kind of chime in a little bit. So Newburgh has been kind of toying with some of these concepts. And so the earlier question, how many duplexes we've done in the last 4 years? None. Do we have some projects in the queue? Potentially, yes. I think Friendsview, I forgot to talk about Friendsview. They're actually doing a cottage as part of their continuum of care program. They're adding some additional duplex units over off of Providence Drive. And so we've issued the land use decision for that, and they've started doing some site work. A couple of other projects based upon the current regulations we have, we did a planned unit development down off of River Street, south of the bypass. And those are on lots of 2,000 square feet, 2,200 square feet. So the concept there again was how can we provide some lower cost housing options from what traditionally we've seen of our history of, 72% of our housing stock is detached single family homes. These are detached single family. They're not cottages. They're just on smaller lots. Another project that we've approved that's working on the public infrastructure is Crestview Crossing. And so that is a project where there'll be a variety of lot sizes that can be, in the 7,000 square foot range down to lots in the 1,500 square foot range. And basically, 2-3-story homes. So kind of narrower, longer. Some of the units have parking loaded off the back. Some of them have off the front. There's some parking fields. So again, with the existing regulations we currently have adopted within our development code, we've been trying to work with developers to be creative of how to provide some smaller lots, smaller size homes rather than what we traditionally see of the the 1,800 to 2,500 square foot single family home on a 3,000 to 5,000 square foot lot with 2 to 3 bathrooms and 3 to 4 bedrooms. We've done some skinnier homes. I call them skinny homes, narrower lots. So we changed our regulations to allow lot widths of 25 feet in our R2 zone. So we've got skinny homes with single car garages. And they're, typically 2 or 3 bedroom homes, a bath and a half, maybe 2 baths, but more of the entry level component of the market that's in Newburgh currently.
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good things to build on there that'll align pretty well with these middle housing types.
So I just put out a call for any final questions or comments about what we presented this evening, and I'm not seeing any. So if any come in, we can loop back to them. But Elizabeth, why don't you go ahead to the next slide?
Yes. Yeah, we want to let you. You want to go ahead, Steve?
Sure. So as we mentioned earlier, you could take a screenshot of this if you want, but these links will be available on the city's website. We have an online survey that asks a little bit more detailed questions than we asked this evening, and gives you a chance to provide comments on your opinions and your priorities around these middle housing types. And so you can see that SurveyMonkey link is the way you do that. I mentioned earlier that we will also post a recording of this meeting and a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation, so you can view and share those if you'd like. And Doug is available by email, or I'm sure phone, if you have any questions or comments, or just want to talk to about any of these issues with him. You can see his email address there. And in terms of staying engaged, we have another advisory committee meeting, the committee's 4th meeting, coming up on January 20th. You can contact Doug if you have any questions about that, but we'll post that information as well. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be working hard. Elizabeth will be working hard, and we'll be supporting her as she develops draft code updates, proposed code updates that we're going to bring to the advisory committee in January, and then to another public meeting the second half of February 2021. That is the extent of our presentation. Doug, do you have anything you want to say before we wrap it up?
I would like to thank Melissa.
Oh, I do have one question that came in. I'm sorry, Doug.
Go ahead.
Is there any kind of financial encouragement for builders to build more of these middle housing units? For example, grants, tax breaks, etc. Maybe getting back to Elizabeth's X-Men analogy, but that might be for either of you, Elizabeth or Doug.
So one of the things that the council recently adopted was a construction excise tax. And so we will be implementing that starting on January 2nd of 2021. And it will be a 1% tax on the building permit values for new residential. Now, if you would work with the city and provide housing that would be 80% or less of the median family income within Newburgh, and we're part of the Portland MSA, is that you would not have to pay that tax, and we would be generating funds from other development to partner with developers to have units that are affordable for 80% or less, but that would require a deed restriction for 60 years. So that's the most recent tool that the council has adopted. We do have a program in place now that we allow 2 units a year to waive their SDCs if they're 80% or less. We are working on an urban renewal program, and part of that program could be infrastructure components that could dovetail with middle housing development to help reduce some of those costs. So it could be some paying some SDCs, it could be covering some building permit costs, it could be some public infrastructure that's needed, sewer, water, storm drainage. The council actually looked at a work program on November 2nd where we had 42 work items identified to address housing in Newburgh. And so we start to break that out with 4 or 5 projects each fiscal year over the next 5 years.
Great. Thanks, Doug. And I interrupted you with your closing remarks. You were just about to thank Melissa, I think.
I was going to thank Melissa and Dominique and Bob and David for participating with us this evening. As Steve had indicated, is that we will have the survey that's out. We will continue to promote that through social media and on our website. So if you have the opportunity, share that with your friends as well and have them come take the survey. And as always, if anybody's got any questions, Steve and Elizabeth had my email address up there, so you can always email me. Don't be surprised if I email you at 1 o'clock in the morning with a response. But I try to be prudent so I don't wake you up in the middle of the night. But we're looking for the public engagement and the opportunity to get the input. This is going to be a change for Newburgh. I mentioned some of the projects we've been migrating towards to try to get some smaller lot sizes and some different housing product than what has traditionally been done. And I should note that some of the information we provided, we are in the process of updating our housing needs analysis, and that will go before the Planning Commission in January and Council in February. And so a few of the numbers will change because our population growth is going to be a little bit slower, but it still keeps with that percentage split where we're looking at 32% of our new housing stock over the next 20 years to be multifamily and 8% for the attached single family. Question might come up, have we done any townhouses in the last 4 years? No, we have not. It's probably closer to a decade ago was the last time someone, a developer came forward and proposed a townhouse development project. And that's actually over by Fred Meyer, to the south of Fred Meyer. That was the last one that we did.
All right. Well, thank you, Doug. Thank you, advisory committee members. Thank you, attendees, either live or watching this recording. And we will look for your feedback via the online survey. Have a good evening.
Thank you all.